Tony, the idea of being unshakable is clearly more than money. But in this context, what does it truly mean to be unshakable?
It's a state of mind. It relates to money because most people, when they're trying to figure out how to create financial freedom, create more stress for themselves, worrying about what's going on. And when you're truly unshakable, you have the mindset where you understand how the market works. You understand that real estate can go up or down, stocks can go up or down, but your family can still do well. Unshakable is a bear market can come, a correction can come, and there's no fear in you. Or if there is a little fear, we're all human, you don't stay there. You find a way to break through, you find your center. And when you have that center, you do what's right to be able to take care of yourself and your family. And I was interviewing about a year and a half ago, the former Fed chair, Alan Greenspan, who for 19 years, the most powerful man in finance in the world under 4 different presidents, spent 5 hours with him, about 3 privately and 2 on stage in front of a group. And one of my final questions to him, and we talked about all this crazy change and all this volatility and how do people get things together, I said, look, if you were back head of the Fed today, what would you do? And there was this long pause. He paused, and he leaned in me and he said, Tony, I'd resign. That did not build much confidence in me or anybody else who'd be watching. And yet, in the midst of all that, as you well know, there's a few unicorns in the financial market, very few. These people that have found a way to do well over all the decades, in good times and in bad. And they know what it takes to be unshakable. And it isn't just guts or confidence, it's understanding certain facts that when you know them, they free you. The metaphor I give people is that, if you go, most of us have heard the old Sufi metaphor of, the man is walking along in the middle of the night and he sees a snake and freaks out and runs away. And he comes in the morning and what does he see? It was a rope. And so once you know it's a rope, you can be there in the middle of the night and you're not scared again. This book, Unshakeable, it's really a financial freedom playbook for anybody. It's the real essentials about how to go from where you are to where you really want to be, but how to do it with peace of mind, how to do it even when things are volatile and enjoy yourself. And I'm really proud that we're also donating 100% of the profits, as we did with Money Master the Game, to feed another 50 million people. I've fed 200 million people the last 2 years with Feeding America's my partner. I'm going to feed 1 billion people, and this is part of that. So this book is something that can change somebody's life, and while you're doing it, really take care of other people that are in need.
Tony, part of this is about psychology, right? Sometimes, for some reason, we focus more on the negative events than we do on the long-term positive ones. So even though, and I think this is freedom fact number 5, that historically, bear markets only happen every 3 to 5 years, for some reason they seem to make an overlarge impression on investor psychology.
Well, I don't care. I was talking to Jack Bogle, who started Vanguard, $3 trillion in assets. And I said, what are you doing in market? He goes, I read all my books and remind myself not to sell anything. Because yes, it happens. Let's just say the figure so everybody understands it. Since 1900, so 115 years, we've had 34 bear markets. Since 1947, we've had 14. So overall, in 115 years, it's averaged every 3 years. In the last 50 years or so, it's averaged about 1 every 5 years. But the problem is that the average drop is 33%, right? And roughly a third of the time, the market drop is 40% or more. Well, when you lose, at least on paper, in your head, that's still the part of our brain that allows us to go into fight or flight, that survival mechanism, is triggered by money issues. They've done MRIs and shown it as if your life was being threatened. And so when that happens, unless you train yourself to be unshakable, unless you know, hey, look, this happens every 3 to 5 years, and if I try to get out, as we're going to show you in a few moments, I'm going to have the wrong timing. I just need to stay in and I won't lose anything. It'll look like I've lost, but over the long term, if I'm willing to stick with it, I can make it happen because we know what the returns are afterwards. We know how the market jumps after we've taken this hit in a bear market. Everybody remembers, where were we in 2009? Where are we today? But what's really important to know is that in the midst of all this, these bear markets last on average a year. There's a few times when they're a couple of years, but usually on average it's a year. So a year really is, any other business, if you could get a Ferrari for 50% off, you would be pretty excited, right? But
much
this is the stock market's the only place in the world when things go on sale where people freak out. And what you want to be is the unshakable. When everyone else is in turmoil, you want to go, this is the greatest opportunity of my life. Let me get these things now because they're going to go back up in value. Because historically, that's what's happened in the US markets for 200 years, 2 centuries. No matter what you do, American business seems to find a way to resolve and become more profitable. Whatever you do, part of that is our population grows, part of that is inflation. And so the combination of these factors and our increased productivity as a society, which keeps growing, especially with technology, allows these markets to continue to grow. So it's going to happen every 3 to 5 years. It's going to be a 33% drop, a 40, 50% drop. But what we're going to show you in this book is how to set up a portfolio, how to diversify so that when that happens, you don't take that kind of a hit. You're still in really great shape. But more importantly, as Peter proved with all of his clients during that time, let's go in and let's take advantage of this. This is the chance to leapfrog from wherever you are financially to where you really want to be, because this is where you're going to see the greatest growth.
Number 7, the greatest danger is actually being out of the market.
Now, this is totally counterintuitive, right? Because everybody says, look, the ideal would be you get in at the right time and go up, and then you get out before it goes down. But no one's ever been able to predict that of the best of the world. But here's the fact that'll blow your mind. JP Morgan did a study, and Schwab, both independently did studies over 20-year periods of time. So 1996 to 2015. And they found that on average, if you were in the S&P 500, you had an 8.2% return, which compounding it over time is extraordinary for people. It helps you get to that wealth. But in those 20 years, if you just missed the 10 best trading days, 10 days out of 20 years, and your return would be 4.5%. It would literally almost be cut in half just by missing those 10 days. How are you going to know in 20 years which of those 10 days are? Give me other statistics of what happens with 20 days.
I think one of the big misperceptions is, okay, if the market's at 10,000, like it was a few years ago, and I wait, well, what are there only 3 things that can happen if I'm in cash? One is the market goes down. I feel great. But am I going to go in at 9,000? Do I really feel great about the market at 9,000 if I didn't feel good at 10? I still have not met that investor in my long career. Second, it goes sideways. I lose. Dividends are better than being in cash or a CD. Third, it goes up. Now, the problem with it going up is it might not come back to 10,000. It might do exactly what it did. Go to 11, 12, 13, 15, 19, 9, You've lost your opportunity. Now, if I go in, there's 3 things that can happen. It goes up. I'm high-fiving everyone around me. It can go sideways. I'm better than cash. It can go down. Big deal. I can buy more, or I wait it out. That's the worst thing in the world that happens is I wait it out. So being out, it's like Tony said, it's counterintuitive. Being out is what results in permanent loss. Being in, the worst outcome that can happen, and it's still a low probability event, is temporary loss of capital.
So, Peter, isn't it also true that those advisors who are not fiduciaries, who are brokers, they will make money whether they're encouraging you to buy or sell? So they actually have a disincentive to advise you, hey, don't do anything, stay the course, you're going to be fine.
I think it's when you're in the brokerage world, you just don't know how anyone's being compensated. And if they disclose it to you, usually there will be conflict. Sometimes they get paid commissions, so there's an incentive for activity. Sometimes they get paid a fee, but only if you're in certain asset classes. So there's an incentive for you to be in those asset classes. Sometimes they get paid different fees in different asset classes, so there's an incentive for you to take risks you might not want to take.
And those incentives have nothing to do with your best interest. It's just the incentives of what makes the most money for the corporation.
Yeah, they might have their own bond desk. They might have their own mutual funds. They might have their own hedge funds. So I think the key is you want to have an advisor. You pay a fee, and that fee is the same on all of the investment advice all of the time. And if you can get yourself to that, which, like Tony said at the top of this, that's extremely rare, unfortunately, in this profession. But if you can find somebody whose investment fee is the same, no matter what they do, no matter what they recommend, that's the best case scenario in terms of at least having an alignment before we even get to the next steps with the advisor.
And I want you to know, I give the 10 days, but let me give them the second statistic that they found. In those 20 years, if you're out of the market 20 days, the 20 best days, your 8.2 drops to 2.1. You might as well have your money in a treasury or something of that nature, right? And if you miss the top 30 days, in 20 years, you lost money. And so how are you ever going to time that? And then the best fact that we found was extraordinary, and this was done by JP Morgan. They found that 6 of the 10 biggest trading days, upsides, were within 2 weeks of the 10 worst trading days. Yeah. So it's like when people's guts are being ripped open, that's when the greatest explosion of opportunity happens. really what we're talking about in real wealth is what is it that makes you feel truly abundant? What makes you feel totally alive? What's life on your terms look like? Because everyone's different. Some people's idea of wealth is a beautiful home with a white picket fence and 3 beautiful children. Some people's idea of extraordinary life is writing beautiful poetry or growing a garden or building a multi-billion-dollar business and employing people and producing resources. There's no right or wrong. The question is, what's going to light you up? Because I can't tell you how many people, including billionaires, I interviewed 50 of them over a period of 3.5 years, and I would not say they all aren't happy, because that's totally not true. You can be rich and happy, you can be poor and you can be happy. Problems are not, I always tell people, problems and happiness have no relationship. You can have tons of problems and be happy.
You can be rich and unhappy.
Exactly right.
Well, that does happen.
So really we're talking about true wealth is between your ears. It's your brain and your heart working together, and it's defining what does life on your terms look like, and then putting a plan in place that really makes that happen, and then making sure you're truly enjoying along the way. Because to me, there's nothing worse than an angry rich man or woman. You want to slap them. They got every resource on the planet, but the challenge is we all have a 2 billion-year-old brain, and it's basically not trained to make you happy. Your brain is trained to make you survive. Right. So survival means I got to look for what's wrong all the time, be prepared for it so I can fight it or flight from it. And in reality, we don't have a saber-toothed tiger to fight off anymore. So now people get stressed, even when they have money, because they think about, what are people thinking of me? Or do I have enough money? When, the average American who's in dire straits, and I don't want to see anybody in dire straits. I feed 100 million people a year for the last 2 years. I'm going to feed 1 billion people through my partnership at Feeding America over the next 8 years. I care. But I also know that if you're in poverty in this country, you're in the 1% of financial people. You're not the 99%, you're 1% of the world. Right. So the resources are available, but what we don't do is appreciate it enough. We let little stuff stress us out and big stuff stress us out. So in the book, the last chapter of the book is how do you organize your life so you don't just wait till someday when you have a certain amount of money and then you're happy, because a lot of people get that amount of money and then they go, is it still enough? Or what don't I have? Or what's happening with my family? They still find a way to be stressed. So money's not the solution, it's a vehicle. And if we use it right, it can enhance the quality of life. Let me give you a simple example. Let's say you have 2 people that are 35 years old, and they've accumulated $100,000 over their entire life, and they're going to invest that $100,000 and nothing else again. And they're going to leave that money in the stock market, say, for 30 years till they're 65 years old. Well, at 65 years old, if you paid 3% in fees, 3.12 is the average according to Forbes, you got $432,000. So your 100 went to 4. It's pretty nice. Mm-hmm. But if you paid 1% in fees, your 100,000 went to $761,000. I mean, here's the other big difference. If you're taking away, say, $60,000 a year for your retirement, the person who got $432,000, it's going to last till they're 79, and the average lifespan's 85 plus. So what's the biggest fear everybody has today? Baby boomers especially, is they're afraid, I'm going to run. They're not afraid of death. Death is way down low, number 2. Number 1 is living without any money, being totally broke, right? And it's going to happen to them. The person that, only had 1% in fees, they're going to last till they're 92 years old on that same amount of money, and they can take more money per, year for their income. So these people have to understand, when you hear a 1% number, what's 1%? Right. 2% amongst friends, But those 1% and 2% and 3% numbers can be the difference between whether you're going to be financially free or you're going to have to work full-time at Walmart in old age, being a greeter or something that's insane. Nobody should have to do that. If they want to do that, that's totally different. But having to do that because someone else got all these fees is just unacceptable. So our goal is blow open the door and show people the truth. Once people know the truth, it's so easy to put yourself in a position where those fees disappear and yet you get greater returns. The worst part is these guys overcharge for underperformance. Yeah. And it's a fact. It's not an opinion that we're expressing. It's studies at Yale, studies in the book, we fill it with studies. So nothing here is opinion. This is all unassailable because it's coming from the greatest investors on the face of the earth and the studies that the universities have done. Step 1 is obsess, get totally focused, unleash your desire, that gives the energy. Step 2 is not waiting. It's massive action, keep changing your approach until you find effective execution. If you're running east looking for a sunset, I don't care how positive you are, you're not going to see the sunset. It's the wrong strategy, right? It's just not going to happen. So you got to have a proven strategy, and you can get there faster, same way I've done it with these books, is saying, I could go this, or I could spend 4 years, interview 50 of the smartest people in the world, all billionaires that started with nothing, and find out what they did, and compress decades into days. That's really the purpose of everything that I do. So when you have that plan and you keep changing your approach, I always tell people, how long would you give your average kid to learn how to walk? Before you turned to the kid and said, dude, it's never gonna happen, you're not a walker, just give it up. Right? People go, you crazy? My kid's gonna keep trying until. Well, that's really step 2. You keep changing your approach until you find it. And then the third step to achievement really is, as simple as it may sound, if you're obsessed, you know what you want, you're taking massive action, maybe you modeled somebody, figure out the right action so you get there quicker, and you're executing, you still need a little grace. Some people call it luck, you could call it God, but I really believe that there's the part we do and then there's the part that comes to us. But I do know grace shows up a lot more when you do the first 2 steps on your own, and grace shows up a lot more when you acknowledge grace in your life, when you acknowledge that I was born in a world where I didn't have to build this internet that I can pull out of my pocket the answer to anything on earth. I'm driving on streets I didn't pave. I'm reading books I didn't have to write. That's the gift of our lives. And I think when we experience that grace, we don't just experience more achievement, but we start to experience more fulfillment.
And grace not only affects your ability to get there, but it affects what you do and how you live once you are there.
It really determines the quality of your life, because unless you live in a state of gratitude, I did an interview with Sir John Templeton, who, as you know, is one of the first billionaire investors and just a brilliant man. He came from nothing, and he donated, I think it was 750, they still do it, the Templeton Fund, I think it's $750 million a year. It's bigger than the Nobel Fund that he donates. And one day I asked him, I said, what is the secret to wealth? And he looked at me, paused, this big smile, and his eyes got really bright, like they always did. And he said, Tony, it's what you teach. I said, well, I teach a lot of things, which thing? And he said, gratitude. He said, because you and I, Tony, know billionaires that are miserable, and it's because they're not grateful for what they have. And we both know people have no money, seemingly, but they're so grateful for their health, for their husband, for their wife, for their children. They're so grateful to God. They're so grateful for their life that they're rich. So I think it starts with that gratitude. It starts with that connection to grace, as simplistic as that sounds. And so it's not enough just to have your financial plan. You can have all the money and be miserable. Let's have the money and be really rich emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. David Swenson, who is the chief investment officer at Yale, took them from 1 billion, which it took them almost 200 years to get to 25 billion in less than 20 years. He's considered the institutional superstar in institutional investing. Said to me that mutual funds charge absorbent fees for a shocking disservice to investors. And he does not pull punches. He says it's insane for you to invest in an actively managed mutual fund, because when you take all these additional costs in there, there's just no way they can consistently beat the market. So all you're doing is giving up your income to someone who's not doing you a service of any sort. It sounds shocking, it sounds absurd, but it's even worse in the 401k industry. I mentioned in the other podcast, for 30 years, that industry, which is a $6 trillion industry, there's 90 million Americans that have a 401k. More people have a 401k than have a home, to give you an idea. But for 30 years, they didn't have to tell you what they charge you. So they just took fees. Some of those fees can be as much as 4%. You could say, I want to invest in an index fund, and many of them won't offer it. But even the ones that do sometimes have a sales load of 3% up front. 3% to get in the game for something that costs 0.05%, 5/100ths%, 5 basis points, right? So it's just crazy the world we live in. And every one of those 1% above that first 1% that you've got to pay or less, that's a decade of income. So if you're paying 2% more, that's 2 decades of income, and you got nothing for it. It's nuts, and it can only happen because there's no transparency. And what we've done with this Unshakeable book is bring you that transparency and show you exactly what it is. And that's also what Peter's firm does, is looks at it and shows you exactly what it is. They read the forms, they figure it out for you. Well, let's start with, most people at this stage, and if they listen to our first podcast, know you want to be in the market, right? And so you would seem it might be simple. Put yourself in low-cost index funds, might be the description a lot of people tell me, and a lot of journalists even say to me, isn't that just the solution? And I'd say, yeah, that's part of the solution, but let's look at reality. Reality is that most individuals are putting their money in the market. They're usually doing it through a mutual fund. And if you look at, Dalbar did a great research study. They said 30-year study from 1985 to 2015, and they said, what did the S&P 500 do? That's easy to calculate, 10.28%. So you're doubling your money about every 7 years. With that kind of compounding, that's how people become wealthy. That's how they get financially free. The only problem is they fortunately figured out what the average investor actually made, and they didn't make the 10.28. And the reason is because, and the number they got was 3.66%.
Huge difference.
Gigantic. Now you're doubling every 20 years as opposed to every 10 years. To give you an idea, over that period of time, if you're compounding through time, $50,000, compounding at 10.28, you're going to have just under $1 million, $941,000. 3.66%, you're going to have $146,000, not $1 million. It's mind-boggling what happens. So why the discrepancy between what the market offered and what the average investor got? The answer to that is two things: fees and fears. Right? We've talked a little about fears in the last podcast, so if you haven't watched it, I hope you will. But we're going to talk about fees here because fees can destroy your financial future. You can do everything right, you can make all the right investments, be all in the right piece, and you got your financial boat moving towards your ultimate goal, and you got not a hole in your boat, you got half the boat missing if the fees are too high.